The structure that we see for NORAD would have to be altered. We'd probably have to get more F-35s.
The United States would.
The United States would.
In order to
fully protect the continent.
With a review underway, the Swedish manufacturer of the Gripen jets is waiting in the wings.
I am wholeheartedly in favor of this. I have not been a proponent of the F-35 for Canada.
Canada is openly challenging the F-35 program, and Trump didn't see it coming. After weeks of pointed warnings from U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra, Ottawa is now weighing Sweden's Gripen as a full alternative, a move that could blow apart a $19 billion F-35 deal, shake Washington's leverage, and pull NORAD into the center of a continental dispute. What Hoekstra framed as a simple requirement for interoperability has become something much bigger, Canada signaling that America no longer dictates its air defense choices. This is no routine procurement pause. It is a political and strategic break from decades of automatic alignment. Public opinion is shifting. Gripen's industrial package is gaining traction, and Hoekstra's pressure campaign has produced the opposite of what Washington intended. Canada is no longer acting like the subordinate partner in North American defense. It is behaving like a sovereign power prepared to make its own call.
The dispute began with rising tension over Canada's slow pace in expanding its F-35 fleet. Ottawa has so far committed to 16 aircraft, but has not confirmed whether it will proceed with the full original plan. Washington, through Ambassador Pete Hoekstra, has insisted repeatedly that more F-35s are essential for continental defense, and that a move towards Sweden's Gripen would weaken interoperability. He has also warned that NORAD's structure might need to adjust if Canada chooses a different path, suggesting American jets would have to fly into Canadian airspace more often. These remarks landed in a country where public skepticism toward the F-35 is already strong. Polling late last year showed that most Canadians prefer an alternative, especially as Denmark acknowledged frequent repair issues and said it might not make the same choice again. Meanwhile, Sweden has put forward a compelling package for the Gripen, including domestic jobs, industrial participation, and the ability to maintain and modify aircraft on Canadian soil. Prime Minister Mark Carney, governing during a period of strained U.S.-Canada relations, now finds himself at a strategic turning point. The decision he makes will shape not just the Air Force, but the balance of power across the northern half of the continent.
Donald Trump entered his second term believing Canada would remain predictable, aligned, compliant, and firmly anchored to U.S. defense expectations. What he has encountered instead is a Canadian government increasingly willing to say no. The F-35 debate is exposing that shift in real time. Canada's hesitation is not a technical matter. It is a response to years of tariff threats, unpredictable policy swings, and a growing sense that Washington views alliances through a transactional lens. Carney's government has been signaling for months that Canada will not allow external pressure to dictate national strategy. Trump's comments and Hoekstra's warnings only deepen that resolve. When an ally suggests that buying a specific American jet is a requirement for a stable defense partnership, it becomes harder to accept the argument as one rooted purely in strategy. The political undertone is impossible to miss, and Canadians feel it. The ambassador's remarks about NORAD being altered if Canada does not proceed with more F-35s created a wave of confusion. NORAD is not a menu item that one partner can revise at will. It is a binational framework built on geography, early warning capability, and shared command responsibilities. Canada's northern radar systems, future over-the-horizon installations, and vast Arctic territory are irreplaceable components. Without them, the United States loses critical reaction time in any continental threat scenario. That is why the idea that Canada could be sidelined or downgraded is more political pressure than operational reality. The F-35 is a valuable part of the NORAD modernization package, but NORAD is far more than one aircraft. Its continuity depends on stable cooperation, not a single procurement decision. If anything, the suggestion that the United States would need to fly into Canadian airspace more often only reveals how essential Canada's participation continues to be. The entry of the Gripen into Canada's debate is changing the tone of the entire conversation. Sweden's aircraft is not viewed as the global gold standard like the F-35, but it is respected for reliability, rapid turnaround, ease of maintenance, and adaptability in harsh climates. More importantly for Canada, Sweden is offering something the United States never does at scale: meaningful domestic production. This aligns directly with Carney's focus on industrial capacity and economic resilience. As Canada tries to rebuild its manufacturing base and increase sovereign control over defense assets, the Gripen presents advantages beyond the aircraft itself. The message is simple: a fighter jet is not just a weapon, it is an industrial strategy. In an age where supply chains can be weaponized, that matters more than ever. The fact that Denmark and other early adopters of the F-35 are voicing serious concerns about readiness and maintenance only gives Ottawa more room to maneuver. Canada would not be acting alone by reconsidering the program. It would be part of a broader reassessment happening across Allied air forces. The political landscape inside Canada has shifted enough to give Carney significant breathing room. Trump's tariff threats against Canada over the past year have damaged trust. His warnings to Carney after the Prime Minister's global stability speech only widened the gap. And with allies in Europe embracing mixed fleet strategies rather than single-platform dependency, the idea of Canada choosing its own path is no longer radical. Carney is also leveraging Canada's deepening relationships in the Indo-Pacific. The new security and industrial agreements with South Korea, alongside interest from Japan and ASEAN economies, demonstrate that Canada is beginning to diversify away from the traditional U.S. axis. A move toward Gripen would fit naturally within that broader shift. The real story is not about aircraft performance or interoperability checklists. It is about control. Canada's geopolitical environment has changed, and so has its tolerance for dependence. After years of witnessing Washington use economic tools to pressure allies, and seeing Trump tie security, trade, and political loyalty together, Ottawa is reassessing the foundations of its defense relationship with the United States. Choosing the Gripen would not break the alliance, but it would signal that Canada is willing to pursue a more autonomous defense posture. That shift is exactly what unsettles Washington. The United States is not used to Canada acting like an independent regional power, yet that is precisely what is happening.
Canada's resistance to Washington's F-35 expectations marks a turning point in North American defense politics. Trump believed the procurement was settled, the alliance was predictable, and the pressure would be enough to secure Ottawa's compliance. Instead, Canada has forced a reckoning over how NORAD functions, how allies cooperate, and how sovereignty is asserted in an era of great power uncertainty. The coming months will determine whether this becomes a full strategic pivot or a high-stakes bargaining phase. But one question now sits at the center of the continent's security future. If Canada no longer accepts that the F-35 is the price of being a good ally, what does the next chapter of North American defense look like? And is Washington prepared for a Canada that finally says no? You're not going to believe this, but Time magazine, yes, the American one, just fell for a Canadian joke. They published a quote from U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra saying Canada could be hit with 500% steel tariffs or one Patriot missile aimed at Parliament Hill. The only problem? The quote wasn't real. It came from a Canadian satire website called The Beaverton. That's right, a joke, but Time printed it like it was a real threat. Now, we could laugh and move on, but the fact that a major U.S. outlet thought that line sounded believable says something deeper about how chaotic Trump's diplomacy has become and how Canada's finally getting tired of playing nice.
The Beaverton calls itself North America's trusted source of news, and most people, of course, do read it for the satire. But in the U.S., Time magazine published one of its made-up quotes as fact. Now, the quote attributed to U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra was first seen in the Beaverton in September. Time quoted this line: "A Canada that it would be very easy to target with 500% steel tariffs or one Patriot missile aimed at Parliament Hill."
Here's what happened. Back in September, Canadian comedy writer Ian McIntyre published a clearly fake quote mocking Pete Hoekstra, the U.S. ambassador who's become known for his loud opinions and awkward takes on Canada-U.S. relations. The Beaverton piece joked that Hoekstra threatened to punish Canada with massive tariffs or even a missile. The point was to exaggerate how absurd the rhetoric had become under Trump's second term. But weeks later, Time magazine, writing about tensions between the two countries, pulled the fake quote and published it like it was a real statement. It took a while before anyone noticed, and when they did, Canadians were amused and a little alarmed. As McIntyre put it, they read a quote about bombing Parliament Hill and thought, yeah, that sounds like him. He then added something sharper. It's almost as if Hoekstra was installed just to break Canada-US relations.
Let's be honest. Under Trump's second term, American diplomacy has become loud, unpredictable, and more like a show than a strategy. Threats are thrown around casually. Allies are treated like obstacles. So when someone reads a fake quote about bombing Canada and thinks, yeah, sounds like something they'd say, that's not just about bad journalism, it's about how far things have slipped. And Hoekstra hasn't helped. He's made a name for himself in Ottawa by picking fights, twisting facts, and acting more like a political influencer than a diplomat. That's why the quote felt real, because, sadly, it wasn't that far off from the tone we've been hearing for months. This wasn't a one-time slip-up. It reflects the new normal in U.S. politics, a space where everything is escalated, exaggerated, and expected to spark outrage. The fact that satire now blends in with reality tells you everything you need to know about how far diplomatic standards have dropped. For Canada, that's not just awkward, it's dangerous. Because when the noise becomes constant, it's harder to tell which threats are real and which ones are just rhetorical grenades tossed for headlines. And in that kind of environment, countries like Canada have no choice but to adapt or be drowned out.
This time, Canada didn't just let it slide. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, the tone has changed. There's more confidence, more clarity, and a lot less patience for nonsense. When Trump raised tariffs again on Canadian steel and lumber, Ottawa didn't beg for talks. It rolled out new limits on imports, supported local producers, and calmly said, "We'll talk when it makes sense, not when you're yelling." And people are noticing. Within Canada, public support for a firmer stance on U.S. relations has grown. Even provincial leaders who used to stay quiet are now backing Ottawa's more assertive approach. Internationally, countries like South Korea, the UAE, and Japan are strengthening ties with Canada, seeing it as a stable, rules-based partner. It's not just about pride anymore, it's about strategy. Canada is showing it can stand up for itself without starting a fight, and that's something many countries, including U.S. allies, quietly respect. The tone from Ottawa isn't angry, it's focused, and it's starting to make Washington look like the one that's overreacting.
Trump wants everyone to believe Canada has no choice but to take the heat, but that's no longer true. In November, the UAE announced it would invest up to $50 billion into Canada, from clean energy to advanced technology. Carney also secured major partnerships in Asia, while Canada quietly builds trade routes and export corridors that skip the U.S. entirely. And those other doors aren't just symbolic. They're backed by steel, ports, digital infrastructure, and national strategy. The Carney government has accelerated export corridor development, including power transmission projects in Atlantic Canada, new Arctic infrastructure, and Pacific trade routes that bypass U.S. bottlenecks. It's not about turning away from the U.S. It's about no longer depending on a partner that thinks shouting is negotiation. For the first time in decades, Canada is aligning diplomacy with industrial capacity, and the world is taking notice. From Seoul to Abu Dhabi, Ottawa is being courted as a serious, stable, rules-based partner, the kind of country investors and allies can trust. In short, Canada's not leaving the table. It's just no longer sitting in the corner.
There's another piece to this story that can't be ignored, how this entire mess affects global perception. When a major U.S. magazine confuses a Canadian joke with real policy, it doesn't just embarrass Washington, it confirms what many countries have started to suspect. America under Trump can no longer tell the difference between strategy and spectacle. And that's where Canada's advantage becomes even clearer. While the U.S. burns credibility with every tariff tantrum and diplomatic blunder, Canada has quietly positioned itself as the adult in the room. Calm, competent, and constructive. Countries that once relied on Washington are now talking to Ottawa, not because Canada is louder, but because it's more reliable. When your neighbor starts mistaking jokes for threats, the world notices, and when you stay grounded, clear-headed, and consistent, the world respects that. In the age of loud politics, Canada's seriousness is starting to look like leadership.
When a major American magazine mistakes satire for reality, something is off. And when the satire is about the United States threatening Canada with a missile, something is very off. But this time, the joke didn't land on Canada. It landed squarely on Washington. It exposed how unpredictable U.S. diplomacy has become and how normalized the hostility toward allies now feels. The more important story, though, is Canada's response. Instead of shrinking back, Canada is stepping forward, protecting its industries, diversifying its partnerships, and building an economy that doesn't depend on whether Washington is having a good day or a bad day. The world is watching, and frankly, the world is comparing. So here's the question we're left with. If the U.S. can mistake a Canadian joke for real policy, how long before Canada decides it doesn't need to wait for them to act normal? Because this time, Canada isn't the one being laughed at. Canada is the one standing tall, while Washington tries to explain how it fell for a joke meant to mock itself.
The U.S. has changed. That's their right. We must respond. That is our imperative. The pipeline will transport at least 1 million barrels of low-emission Alberta bitumen a day, with a route that increases access to new Asian markets as a priority. We're taking our future in our hands. We're catalyzing generational investments by creating the right conditions to get big things built here in Alberta and right across Canada.
Canada just pulled off a move almost no ally of the United States has ever dared to attempt. While Donald Trump doubles down on tariffs and rewrites America's place in global trade, Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped to a podium in Calgary and made an announcement that Washington never believed Ottawa would have the courage to make. Canada is preparing to send its energy directly to Asia through a new Pacific pipeline bypassing the United States entirely. For decades, one rule quietly governed North American energy. If Canada wanted to sell oil, it flowed south. But today, in a moment that will redefine the relationship between the two countries, Carney signaled that the days of unquestioned dependence on the American market are over.
The announcement came during a major address where Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith unveiled a federal-provincial framework to build a new export pipeline from northern Alberta to the British Columbia coast. Unlike the symbolic proposals of the past, this one comes with a clear commitment: a privately financed pipeline built with Indigenous co-ownership capable of moving up to 1 million barrels of low-emission Alberta bitumen a day straight to Asian markets. Carney made it clear that Ottawa will fast-track the project under the new Major Projects Office, which was created specifically to accelerate nation-building infrastructure. And in the sharpest break yet from old political taboos, he announced that Canada is prepared to adjust its own tanker restrictions, long seen as untouchable, if they stand in the way of accessing Asian buyers. Alongside the pipeline plan, Carney openly addressed the underlying reason for this shift. Trump's tariff regime, combined with escalating uncertainty from Washington, has cost Canada an estimated $50 billion so far, a figure sourced from Canadian internal economic modeling and widely echoed by analysts covering North American trade. Carney reminded the audience that 95% of Canadian energy exports still go to the United States, and that the vast majority of lumber, steel, and aluminum also depend on American buyers. What used to be a strategic advantage has now become, in his words, a vulnerability. Then he delivered the line that instantly changed the tone of the room. The U.S. has changed. That's their right. We must respond. That is our imperative. It was the clearest signal yet that Canada is ready to operate by new rules. Since returning to the White House, Trump has treated tariffs as a universal tool. Pressure Canada, pressure Mexico, pressure China, pressure Europe.
The underlying theory is that every partner needs access to the U.S. market more than the U.S. needs access to theirs. It is a worldview built on leverage. The problem for Washington is that Canada just upended this logic. Instead of retaliating tariff for tariff, Carney chose a far more consequential path. He created a new route for Canadian energy that no longer depends on American politics or American refiners. In practical terms, this means the United States loses the near-exclusive position it once held over Canadian heavy crude. For decades, U.S. Gulf Coast refineries relied on Canadian heavy oil as their most stable and cost-effective supply. Analysts have long described this dependence as structural. It takes years and billions of dollars to reconfigure refineries away from heavy crude. When Canada builds a corridor to Asia, it weakens the United States' negotiating position not for a year or two, but for an entire generation. Trump may escalate tariffs, but he can't change the physics of America's refining system. The simple truth is this: the United States needs Canadian heavy crude more than Canada needs American buyers. That is why this decision hits harder than any counter tariff ever could.
What makes this moment unprecedented isn't just the pipeline itself, it's the political symbolism behind it. No traditional U.S. ally, not Japan or South Korea or Germany, has structured a national energy strategy explicitly designed to bypass the United States. Canada is the first. This shift speaks to a growing reality. Since Trump's return, Ottawa has faced a wave of policies that treat Canada less like a partner and more like a bargaining chip. Aluminum duties, lumber duties, auto threats, battery incentives tied to U.S.-only sourcing. For months, Canada absorbed the pressure. Now, Carney is sending a message. Canada will not be cornered. He paired the pipeline plan with a broader strategy worth over $1 trillion in total investment over 5 years, including new hydro, nuclear, LNG, critical minerals, and sovereign AI infrastructure. These are not defensive measures, they're offensive. They're designed to build a diversified, resilient economy that does not hinge on who sits in the Oval Office.
Energy demand in Asia is long-term, predictable, and rising. Japan and South Korea continue to rely heavily on imported energy. India is searching for stable suppliers. Southeast Asia's consumption is expanding rapidly. Meanwhile, the United States under Trump has become a market defined by volatility, one where tariffs shift overnight, subsidies shift with political cycles, and allies are constantly forced to recalculate their exposure. For Canadian producers, Asian markets offer something the U.S. doesn't: long contracts, reliable pricing, and less political interference. If Canada can deliver its oil directly to Asia, the discount applied to Canadian crude in American markets shrinks dramatically. That means higher revenues, stronger royalties, and greater economic independence. Once that happens, no U.S. administration, Trump or otherwise, can treat Canada as a captive supplier again.
Trump will not ignore this shift. Washington will frame it as a betrayal, a miscalculation, or a political stunt. There will be warnings about air auto tariffs, cross-border energy rules, or even new constraints on Canadian imports. But none of these threats altered the basic structural reality. The United States cannot replace Canadian heavy oil, and Canada is no longer willing to accept a future built entirely around U.S. demand. This moment represents something far bigger than a pipeline. It is Canada stepping out of America's shadow, not with anger, but with strategy. When future historians look back on 2025, this announcement may be remembered as the moment Canada redefined its role in North America. For decades, Canadians were told they had no choice but to rely on the United States. Mark Carney just proved that was never true. Canada is no longer waiting for Washington to treat it fairly. Canada is building the world it wants, the partners it chooses, and the economy it controls. And now the real question begins. If Canada can take this bold a step once, what will it do next? And how will Trump respond when he realizes that for the first time in a generation, he has no leverage left?
Another renewable energy source could soon be coming to the forefront in Canada. Near the beginning of November, Max Power Mining Corporation successfully drilled Canada's first dedicated natural hydrogen well near Central Butte. The company's incoming CEO says energy is like a buffet, with every sector playing its part.
Canada just pulled off something big, something that could redefine the entire balance of power in North American energy. While Washington is still arguing about tariffs, drilling leases, and whether EVs are patriotic enough, Canada quietly drilled the country's first natural hydrogen well in Saskatchewan. And unlike the usual political theater, this move actually means something. It's practical, it's strategic, and it places Canada ahead in a race most countries haven't even realized has started. Natural hydrogen, the kind generated underground by geological processes, has long been treated like a scientific curiosity. The U.S. Geological Survey has published maps showing America has promising zones, but U.S. companies haven't moved past early exploration. Canada, meanwhile, did it. A functioning well, real data, and a team preparing for commercial flow tests. In the middle of a trade war climate where the U.S. is weaponizing tariffs, pushing allies into corners, and demanding supply chain obedience, Canada just opened a door into a new source of clean, scalable, and potentially exportable energy. This wasn't just a drilling operation. It was a message. Canada is building its own future.
In early November, Max Power Mining Corporation completed Canada's first dedicated natural hydrogen well outside central Saskatchewan. The well reached over 2 kilometers deep and hit multiple hydrogen-bearing zones. For a long time, geologists debated whether natural hydrogen existed underground in usable quantities. Saskatchewan just proved that it does. The chief geoscientist behind the project described natural hydrogen exploration as a chess match, the kind that rewards patience, skill, and an understanding that the Earth doesn't give up its secrets easily. Max Power now has 6 additional concept sites ready for evaluation, with the company preparing a full round of flow testing to confirm commercial viability. The timing couldn't be more remarkable. Canada's energy system is already one of the cleanest in the world, with an 85% clean electricity grid powered by hydro, nuclear, and growing renewable capacity. Prime Minister Mark Carney has spent the past year promoting a diversified, Asia-oriented trade strategy as the U.S. under President Donald Trump doubles down on tariffs, protectionism, and demands for allies to fall in line. Now Canada has stumbled upon a resource that could speed up the energy transition, power AI-driven data centers, reduce water usage, and eventually become a new export sector. All at the moment the U.S. is squeezing neighbors with 25% to 100% tariffs and threatening new import restrictions. Hydrogen wasn't supposed to be part of the political story, but now it is.
While America debates which state should host the next oil lease, Canada is doing what innovators do, moving first. Natural hydrogen is still a frontier resource. The world has barely scratched the surface. But leadership matters. The country that proves the resource is real will shape the standards, the technology, and eventually the market. Today, that country is Canada. The United States has geological potential, but no major company has drilled a purpose-built hydrogen well to full depth. Canada has. And in geopolitics, the difference between might be possible and we already did it is enormous. Trump's second term has made one thing clear: energy and trade are now the same battlefield. The U.S. has slapped tariffs on Canadian steel, lumber, aluminum, autos, and now even trucks and agricultural goods. The message is simple: Washington wants leverage. But leverage only works when the other country depends on you. Canada developing a new source of clean domestic energy weakens that dependence. Natural hydrogen could support heavy industry, AI data centers, export corridors to Asia, or even clean fuel markets in Europe, all while reducing Canada's vulnerability to U.S. supply disruptions. It's not that hydrogen will replace oil tomorrow, but markets move on signals, and the signal from Saskatchewan is that Canada is not standing still. Mark Carney has spent 2025 building new partnerships across South Korea, Japan, ASEAN, and China. APEC 2025 made one thing clear. Asia is opening its door to Canadian energy, technology, and supply chains. Natural hydrogen fits into that pivot beautifully. South Korea just signed a defense industrial partnership with Canada. Japan is expanding clean tech investment. China wants to reset relations and is hungry for cleaner fuels. A future hydrogen exporter with political stability and environmental credibility, that is a role Canada is perfectly positioned to play. And it is a role the United States cannot block with tariffs.
Historically, America dominates new energy markets. From shale oil to LNG exports, the U.S. usually moves first and forces others to catch up. But natural hydrogen is different. The U.S. has maps, draft policies, and pilot projects, but no major commercial drilling success story. Canada now holds the milestone. With Washington locked in tariff disputes, angry refinery lobbying, and political battles over environmental rules, the U.S. is distracted. Clean energy investors notice, artificial intelligence firms notice, data center developers notice, especially since natural hydrogen could dramatically reduce water use compared to cooling today's AI clusters. A Canada that can power next-generation computing without relying on U.S. gas or U.S. political unpredictability becomes a very attractive partner. Let's be honest. Canadians have taken one hit after another this year. Jeep production moved south. Trump imposed more tariffs. GM shut its Ontario electric van line. Washington has tried to use energy as leverage repeatedly. And then suddenly, Canada scores a clean tech win entirely on its own soil. No U.S. subsidy, no White House pressure, no multinational dictating the terms. Just Canadian geologists, Canadian land, Canadian innovation, and a well that may open the door to a brand new industry. For a country often framed as reacting to U.S. decisions, this is a rare and welcome reversal.
Canada's first natural hydrogen well is more than a scientific breakthrough. It is a statement of intent. While the United States leans deeper into protectionism and tariff leverage, Canada is building the industries of the future: clean energy, AI-ready infrastructure, and Asia-connected trade routes. If commercial tests succeed, Canada will not only gain a new domestic resource, it will gain bargaining power, it will gain independence, and it will gain credibility as a country capable of leading, not waiting. So the real question is simple. If this is what Canada can achieve with its first hydrogen well, what happens when the next 6 come online? Because for the first time in a long time, Canada isn't following. Canada is setting the pace.